high due to the high density of population here. Population within the caldera.
It's literally like living on a volcano.
Yes, in
A
within
volcano.
a volcano.
But how can that be? How can people be permitted to live in a volcano?
Imagine waking up to steam erupting from cracks in your street. Within 12 minutes, 847 people dialed emergency services, all screaming the same thing. What happened next will haunt you. Scientists made a discovery so terrifying they're calling it the first domino. An 8-kilometer crack just connected Europe's deadliest supervolcano to the mountain that buried Pompeii alive. But here's what they're not telling you. The pathway is expanding every single day.
When I see increase in the activity, earthquakes, increase of gas emission, of course, those are important parameters.
Potential warning signs.
Yes, but something can change tomorrow. My feeling is, of course, that the volcano is in an increasing unrest.
Increasing unrest. Now, today.
Now.
3.5 million people are trapped between two awakening giants that now operate as one. What happens next could reshape Europe forever, and we might already be too late. Pozzuoli sits within the Campi Flegrei caldera, a volcanic system located just west of Naples. The city has experienced volcanic unrest before, with periods of ground uplift and seismic activity that have become almost routine for residents over the decades. But what happened in the early hours of that March morning was different. The steam. Emissions were concentrated along what geologists would soon identify as a fault line, one that extended deep into the earth beneath the city. Initial surveys suggested the fracture reached down approximately 8 kilometers, an extraordinary depth that indicated something significant was happening in the volcanic system below. What truly shocked researchers, however, was the direction this fault line was taking. As geological teams mapped the underground fracture over the following days, they made a discovery that contradicted long-held assumptions about the region's volcanic systems. The fault line was not contained within the Campi Flegrei caldera. Instead, it extended eastward, creating a direct physical connection to Mount Vesuvius, the infamous volcano that destroyed Pompeii in 79 AD. The two volcanic systems, which scientists had studied independently for decades, were now linked by an active geological pathway. The earthquake that triggered this connection struck at exactly 3:42 in the morning local time. Measuring magnitude 4.4 on the Richter scale, it was the most powerful tremor the Campi Flegrei region had experienced in over 40 years. Residents across Pozzuoli were jolted awake by violent shaking that sent furniture crashing to the floor and shattered windows throughout the city. In those first chaotic moments, most people assumed they were experiencing another episode of the region's periodic seismic unrest. The true significance of the earthquake would only become clear as scientists began analyzing the data it produced. Researchers at Stanford University received the seismic readings from Italian monitoring stations within hours of the quake, using advanced artificial intelligence techniques developed specifically for earthquake analysis. They began processing the data in ways that conventional seismographs could not. The AI system was designed to detect patterns and signals that human analysis might miss, expanding the earthquake signature to reveal activity hidden within the larger seismic event. What the system uncovered was staggering. Buried within the data from that single 4.4 magnitude earthquake were approximately 54,000 microtremors that standard monitoring equipment had completely missed. These microtremors told a story that deeply concerned the Stanford team. The earthquake had not simply shaken the ground and subsided. It had triggered a cascade of smaller seismic events throughout the caldera, indicating that something fundamental had changed in the geological structure beneath Pozzuoli. The AI analysis revealed that the quake had activated what geologists call ring faults, the circular fracture systems that form the boundaries of volcanic calderas. These ring faults at Campi Flegrei had remained largely dormant for centuries. The March earthquake had awakened them, and they were now releasing bursts of seismic energy that rippled through the surrounding crust in waves. Dr. Tatiana Ventura, a geophysicist, working with the Stanford Earth Sciences Department, was among the first to recognize the implications of what the data was showing. In her assessment, the geothermal reservoir beneath Campi Flegrei operates as a sealed pressure system. When the overlying rock layer fractures, as it did during the March earthquake, it creates pathways for fluids and gases to migrate through the crust. More critically, these pathways can destabilize other connected volcanic systems. According to Ventura's analysis, the seal containing the pressure beneath Campi Flegrei had broken, and that pressure was now moving through the newly opened fault line. The Stanford team traced the seismic ripples from the earthquake to their ultimate destination. The data showed clearly that the tremors had opened a deep conduit in the earth, one that was funneling pressure waves from the magma chamber beneath Campi Flegrei directly toward Mount Vesuvius. This was not merely surface cracking or shallow faulting. The pathway extended 8 kilometers down into the earth, reaching depths where magmatic fluids and superheated gases circulate through the volcanic plumbing system. What had been two separate volcanic systems, each with its own magma chamber and pressure dynamics, were now physically connected by an active geological channel. The discovery triggered immediate alerts to volcanic monitoring stations across Italy and Europe. Italian authorities were contacted within hours of the Stanford analysis, reaching preliminary conclusions. The implications were clear and deeply troubling. This was not an isolated seismic event that would settle down after a few aftershocks. This was not routine volcanic unrest of the type Campi Flegrei had experienced periodically over the past 70 years. What the data indicated was a systemic destabilization of two volcanic systems that the scientific community had always treated as independent entities operating on their own timelines. For decades, geology, textbooks and academic research had operated under the assumption that while Campi Flegrei and Vesuvius were part of the same broader volcanic region, they functioned separately. Each had its own magma source, its own pattern of activity, its own eruption history. Emergency planning and volcanic monitoring had been structured around this assumption. Evacuation routes were designed for scenarios involving one volcano or the other, not both simultaneously. Risk assessments calculated the probability of eruptions at each site independently. The entire framework for understanding and managing volcanic risk in the Naples area rested on the premise that Campi Flegrei and Vesuvius were separate threats. The rupture in March 2025 shattered that premise. In a matter of hours, an earthquake had accomplished what geologists considered highly unlikely, if not impossible. It had created a direct physical pathway between Europe's largest volcanic caldera and the stratovolcano that had produced one of history's most famous and devastating eruptions. The two systems were no longer operating in isolation. The pressure building beneath Campi Flegrei could now influence conditions at Vesuvius, and vice versa. The sealed boundaries that had kept these volcanic systems separate had been breached, and the consequences of that breach were only beginning to emerge. The Campi Flegrei caldera, where these dramatic events unfolded, represents one of the most dangerous volcanic systems anywhere on Earth. The name itself translates from Italian as burning fields, a reference that becomes chillingly appropriate when examining the caldera's geological history. Spanning roughly 8 miles in diameter, this massive volcanic depression sits just west of Naples, one of Italy's largest and most densely populated cities. What makes Campi Flegrei particularly concerning is not just its size or location, but the sheer destructive power it has demonstrated throughout its 600,000-year history. The caldera's origins trace back to two catastrophic eruptions that rank among the most violent volcanic events in European geological history. The first occurred approximately 39,000 years ago and is known to geologists as the Campanian ignimbrite eruption. The scale of this event is difficult to comprehend using modern reference points. The eruption ejected roughly 200 cubic kilometers of volcanic material into the atmosphere. To put that in perspective, imagine a superheated mixture of ash, rock fragments, and volcanic gases traveling at speeds approaching 300 miles per hour, sweeping across the Italian peninsula and beyond. The ash and debris from this single eruption blanketed large portions of Eastern Europe in thick layers that are still visible in geological records today. The environmental consequences of the Campanian ignimbrite eruption extended far beyond the immediate blast zone. The massive quantities of ash and sulfur dioxide injected into the upper atmosphere triggered global climate disruptions that persisted for years. Temperature dropped as sunlight was blocked by the volcanic haze. Growing seasons shortened. Ecosystems collapsed across wide regions. Archaeological and paleontological evidence suggests that the eruption contributed to significant changes in both animal populations and early human settlements across Europe. Some species disappeared entirely from the fossil record following the event, while human populations appear to have experienced dramatic declines in the affected regions. But Campi Flegrei was not finished with its geological fury. Approximately 15,000 years ago, a second massive eruption occurred. Known as the Neapolitan Yellow Tuff eruption, this event unleashed another 200 cubic kilometers of volcanic material. This second apocalyptic episode carved out much of the caldera structure that exists today, creating the depression that now lies beneath some of Italy's most populated areas. The yellow-colored rock deposits from this eruption are still visible throughout the Naples region, a constant reminder of the violent forces that shape the landscape. Today, roughly 3 million people live directly above the geological scars left by these ancient catastrophes. Dr. Giuseppe Mastrolorenzo of the INGV Vesuvius Observatory has spent years studying what makes Campi Flegrei fundamentally different from other volcanic systems. According to his research, the caldera's geological structure essentially functions as a massive pressure vessel. Beneath the surface lie magma chambers at various depths, ranging from 3 to 8 kilometers below ground. Unlike cone-shaped stratovolcanoes such as Mount Vesuvius or Mount Etna, calderas operate as interconnected systems where pressure changes in one chamber can affect the entire network. This interconnectivity means that Campi Flegrei does not behave like a single volcanic vent that might erupt from one location. Instead, the magmatic plumbing beneath Pozzuoli forms a complex network of chambers and conduits all linked together in what Mastrolorenzo describes as a delicate balance of pressure and instability. When one part of this system becomes disturbed, the effects do not remain localized. The pressure changes ripple outward through the network in ways that can be unpredictable and potentially catastrophic. This is not simply a mountain that might explode from its peak. This is an entire pressure system that could rupture in multiple locations simultaneously. The geological structure means that monitoring and predicting eruptions at Campi Flegrei presents challenges that differ significantly from those at more conventional volcanoes. And now, with the discovery that this pressure system has established a direct connection to Vesuvius, those challenges have multiplied exponentially. For the residents of Pozzuoli and the surrounding areas, living in the shadow of Campi Flegrei has meant decades of coexistence with volcanic unrest. Historical records document 4 major periods of significant agitation since 1950. Each of these episodes has followed a pattern that scientists have come to recognize, and disturbingly, each period of unrest appears to be more intense than the previous one. The cycle typically begins with a phenomenon that geologists call bradyseism, a term derived from Greek words meaning slow earthquake. This refers to the gradual rising and falling of the ground surface in response to movements of magma and hydrothermal fluids beneath the caldera. In Pozzuoli, bradyseism has manifested in dramatic and visible ways. Ancient Roman ruins that once stood on dry ground have slowly been submerged beneath the waters of the harbour as the land tilts and deforms. In other periods, the ground has risen substantially, lifting the seafloor and changing the coastline. NASA satellite monitoring has tracked this ground deformation over many decades, providing a detailed record of how the caldera inflates and deflates in response to pressure changes below. Since 1950, the overall uplift at Campi Flegrei has reached a staggering 4.3 meters, or roughly 14 feet. Recent measurements have shown that current uplift rates have accelerated to approximately 2 centimeters per month, representing a 340% increase over uplift rates observed during previous periods of unrest. As pressure builds within the caldera, the ground does more than just rise. The surrounding rock begins to fracture under the stress, producing earthquakes. During the particularly intense unrest crisis that occurred between 1982 and 1984, Campi Flegrei generated approximately 16,000 earthquakes. Many of these were strong enough to cause significant alarm among residents, sending families fleeing from their homes as buildings cracked and walls collapsed. Some residents reported sleeping in their cars for weeks, too frightened to return indoors while the ground continued to shake beneath them. The psychological toll of living through thousands of earthquakes over a 2-year period left lasting impacts on the community. Alongside the ground deformation and seismic activity, periods of volcanic unrest at Campi Flegrei are characterized by increased emissions of volcanic gases. Fumaroles, which are vents that release volcanic gases, and bubbling mud pools scattered throughout the caldera begin to intensify their output. These emissions carry noxious fumes laden with carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and hydrogen sulfide. The air takes on the acrid smell of sulfur, often described as resembling rotten eggs. Residents during these periods report suffering from headaches, nausea, and burning sensations in their eyes and throats from exposure to the gases. The chemical composition of these emissions provides scientists with important clues about what is happening deep beneath the surface, as different gases indicate different temperatures and depths of origin. The final characteristic stage of Campi Flegrei's unrest involves thermal anomalies. As magma rises closer to the surface, ground temperatures begin to spike in localized areas across the caldera. Monitoring stations have recorded some zones reaching temperatures hot enough to cook food on bare rock, a vivid and unsettling reminder of the extreme heat lurking just below the surface. These thermal hotspots shift and change as magma moves through the underground system, and tracking their patterns helps scientists understand the dynamics of what is happening at depth. The events following the March 2025 earthquake demonstrated that something unprecedented was occurring. Within just 48 hours of the ground rupture, the signs of destabilization became impossible to ignore. Thermal monitoring stations positioned along the newly formed fault line registered temperature increases of 12 degrees Celsius. For volcanologists, this reading suggested something deeply troubling. The temperature spike indicated that magmatic fluids were actively moving between the two volcanic systems. The underground pathway was not merely a static crack in the rock. It was becoming an active conduit, a highway along which heat, pressure, and volcanic materials could travel between Campi Flegrei and Vesuvius. Steam emissions provided further evidence of the connection. Vents that had been dormant for decades suddenly roared back to life across both volcanic systems simultaneously. The output of steam increased by 340% in less than 2 days. Plumes of vapor rose into the atmosphere, visible from Naples and captured by numerous photographers and news crews. But the steam itself told an even more alarming story to those who analyzed it. Chemical testing revealed that the emissions were now heavily laced with sulfur compounds, the telltale signature of deep magmatic gases rising toward the surface. The chemistry had changed from what these vents had been producing previously, and the change indicated that the source of the gases had deepened. Material from far to adds below was now finding its way to the surface. Then came perhaps the most significant development of all. For the first time since its last eruption in 1944, Mount Vesuvius began experiencing deep seismic activity. These were not shallow tremors caused by surface adjustments or thermal expansion of rock. These were pressure waves originating from within the magma chamber itself, detected by seismographs at depths that indicated magmatic movement. The mountain that had buried Pompeii nearly 2,000 years ago was responding to what was happening 8 kilometers away at Campi Flegrei. The connection was not theoretical. It was active, functional, and growing stronger. The realization that Campi Flegrei and Vesuvius were now operating as a connected system forced emergency planners to confront an uncomfortable truth. The evacuation protocols and disaster response plans that had been developed over decades were suddenly obsolete. Italian civil protection authorities had designed their strategies around the assumption that they would face one volcanic threat at a time. The plans identified specific evacuation zones, designated escape routes, and calculated timeframes based on scenarios involving either Campi Flegrei or Vesuvius erupting individually. The March 2025 connection had invalidated these fundamental assumptions overnight. The Naples metropolitan area is home to over 3 million people. In the aftermath of the ground rupture, all of them found themselves living in the shadow of what was effectively a newly awakened supervolcano system. Life continued with a surface appearance of normality. Cafes still served espresso, children still walked to school, businesses remained open. But beneath this veneer of routine, the ground trembled with increasing frequency, and the emergency plans designed to protect the population had become dangerously inadequate for the reality they now faced. The logistical challenges of evacuating such a densely populated area under certain normal circumstances would be immense. But in a scenario where both volcanoes might erupt simultaneously, those challenges become almost insurmountable. Traffic modeling conducted by emergency management specialists revealed a critical problem with the existing road network. Many of the routes leading away from Campi Flegrei funnel directly toward Vesuvius. Evacuation corridors overlap and contradict each other. Computer simulations showed that the highways would become completely choked with traffic within hours of an evacuation order. 3.5 million people attempting to flee the region simultaneously would overwhelm not just the road network, but communication systems, emergency services, and every aspect of disaster response infrastructure. Civil protection authorities activated emergency protocols immediately following the discovery of the connection. For the first time in Italian history, both volcanoes would be monitored and managed as a unified threat. This represented a fundamental shift in approach, requiring coordination between monitoring teams, emergency services, and government agencies that had previously operated with separate mandates. New procedures had to be developed quickly for a scenario that had no historical precedent and no existing playbook. The situation on the ground offered little comfort to those tracking the developments. Steam vents continued to open daily across Pozzuoli. Roads buckled and cracked as the earth shifted beneath them, requiring constant repairs and sometimes forcing closures. Buildings showed new fractures each morning as the ground deformation continued. Residents lived with constant reminders that pressure was building below, manifested in the physical degradation of their environment. The smell of sulfur became a regular feature of daily life in certain neighborhoods. Small earthquakes, some barely perceptible and others strong enough to rattle dishes, occurred with such frequency that many residents stopped, remarking on them. But the danger extended far beyond the immediate Naples area. Atmospheric scientists began modeling what would happen if both volcanic systems erupted in a coordinated event. The projections were sobering. Volcanic ash clouds could blanket much of southern Europe, grounding all air traffic across the Mediterranean region. The 2010 eruption of Eyjafjallajökull in Iceland, a relatively modest event, had caused widespread flight cancellations and economic disruption across Europe. A major eruption from the connected Campi Flegrei and Vesuvius system would be orders of magnitude larger, potentially paralyzing European air travel for weeks or months. The health implications of such ash clouds extend beyond flight safety. Volcanic ash consists of tiny glass-like particles that can cause severe respiratory problems. Hospitals hundreds of kilometers from the eruption site would face surges in emergency admissions as people struggled to breathe. Those with existing respiratory conditions would be particularly vulnerable. Public health officials across southern Europe began reviewing their stockpiles of respirators and developing protocols for mass distribution of protective equipment. Agricultural impacts formed another major concern in the modelling scenarios. The region's farmland produces food that feeds millions of people across Europe. A major ashfall could bury crops under meters of volcanic debris, destroying entire harvests within hours. The ash would not simply wash away with rain. Instead, it would cement into a hardened layer that would render fields unusable for potentially years. The resulting food crisis would ripple across the European continent, driving up prices and creating shortages of staples that consumers typically take for granted. Economic analysts warned that the agricultural devastation alone could have consequences lasting a decade or more. Scientists monitoring the situation began using a phrase that captured the most frightening possibility of all. They called the Campi Flegrei and Vesuvius connection the first domino. The concern was not simply about these two volcanoes, it was about what their eruption might trigger across the broader Mediterranean volcanic system. The region hosts numerous other volcanic sites beyond the Italian mainland. Mount Etna in Sicily stands as Europe's most active volcano. Santorini in the Aegean Sea sits above a caldera that produced one of history's most devastating eruptions around 1600 BC. Stromboli, off the Italian coast, has been in nearly continuous eruption for thousands of years. Volcanic islands dot the Mediterranean sea floor, many of them connected to the same deep geological networks. Seismic tomography studies, which use earthquake waves to create images of the Earth's interior, have revealed that the magma reservoir feeding Campi Flegrei and Vesuvius extends far beyond their immediate boundaries. If the pressure released from these two volcanoes propagates through interconnected underground systems, it could potentially trigger eruptions at other locations across the region. The physics of volcanic systems means that pressure seeks release through any available pathway. If multiple pathways exist through a connected network, the pressure could activate dormant volcanoes that have been quiet for centuries or even millennia. Such a cascading sequence of volcanic eruptions would occur on a scale not witnessed since the dawn of recorded human history. The last time Mediterranean volcanoes erupted in coordinated sequence, there were no major cities, no modern infrastructure, no millions of people concentrated in urban areas within the blast zones. Historical eruptions occurred when human populations were sparse and largely rural. the same event occurring today would be unprecedented in its human impact. Dr. Mauro Rosi, a volcanologist who has studied the region for decades, described the emerging situation in stark terms during interviews with Italian media. He emphasized that researchers were dealing with a completely new paradigm in volcanic risk assessment. The connection between the two systems had the potential to impact millions of people and fundamentally reshape the geography of southern Italy. The standard tools and frameworks that volcanologists had developed for understanding volcanic hazards were proving inadequate for this scenario. Volcanologists and geophysicists from research institutions around the world began converging on the region in the weeks following the March earthquake. They came equipped with portable seismographs, gas analyzers, thermal cameras, and other monitoring equipment. International collaboration intensified as scientists recognized they were observing something that modern monitoring technology had never captured before. No one alive had witnessed volcanic systems reconnecting in real time. The scientific community found itself operating in completely uncharted territory, without historical analogues or case studies to guide their understanding. The nature of the scientific debate shifted fundamentally. Researchers were no longer discussing whether an eruption might occur. The accumulating evidence pointed toward eruption as an inevitable outcome. The questions now focused on timing, scale, and geographic extent. Would the eruption be confined to one or both of the currently active systems? Would it trigger the feared cascade across the Mediterranean? How much warning time would populations have to evacuate? These questions had no clear answers, only probabilities and scenarios based on incomplete data. The Italian government raised the alert level for both volcanoes to the highest classification, indicating that an eruption could be imminent. This designation triggered formal emergency planning processes across multiple government agencies. Military units began positioning equipment and personnel for potential mass evacuation operations. Regional hospitals updated their disaster response protocols. Schools developed procedures for rapid student evacuation. The machinery of national emergency response began grinding into motion. International response teams from across Europe started positioning themselves at staging areas in cities surrounding the threatened zone. The European Union activated its civil protection mechanism, coordinating offers of assistance from member states. Countries pledged search and rescue teams, medical personnel, temporary housing units, and other resources. The scale of the potential disaster required preparation on a truly continental level. Shipping companies that operate in the Mediterranean began drafting contingency routes to maintain cargo flow if major ports became unusable. Airlines updated their volcanic ash protocols, reviewing procedures for rerouting flights and managing extended groundings. Insurance companies reassessed their exposure to volcanic risk across southern Europe. Financial markets began factoring volcanic uncertainty into their calculations. The economic ripples from the geological events beneath Naples spread through systems far removed from volcanology. Every day brought new data points that monitoring teams recorded and analyzed. Seismographs registered tremors with increasing frequency. Satellites photographed new steam vents appearing across both volcanic systems. Survey teams measured fresh cracks in the streets of Pozzuoli, documenting how quickly the deformation was progressing. The numbers continued climbing in directions that offered no reassurance. Thermal signatures grew hotter. Concentrations of sulfur in gas emissions increased. The underground corridor connecting the two volcanoes showed continued expansion in seismic imaging. 3.5 million people waited, watching the ground beneath their feet transform. They smelled the sulfur drifting from vents that opened in unexpected places. They felt the tremors that came more frequently with each passing week. They understood that ancient geological forces had reconnected beneath their homes. They recognized that what happened next had no modern precedent, no proven playbook, and no guaranteed outcome. The caldera that had erupted catastrophically twice before in deep prehistory was building towards something. The mountain that had buried Pompeii was responding to signals from 8 kilometers away. The pathway between them grew wider and hotter with each day that passed, and no one could say with certainty when the pressure would finally exceed what the rock could contain.